The German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel once said that it is in fact the wish for rational insight and not the ambition to amass a mere heap of acquisitions that should preoccupy our minds if we want to carry out a scientific study. What does that mean? That means that it's not enough. In order to understand deep and complex phenomena, it's not enough to acquire loads and loads of quantities of facts, but rather to understand the underlying principles and contradictions which are driving those particular phenomena. My name is Hamid Alizadeh. This is Against the Stream, and I'm here with Fred Weston today. Fred, the pace of events in today's world is breathtaking. You can spend many lifetimes just reading through the news, events that are taking place in one country after another. And I think a lot of people, I've heard this from a lot of people, they say that the world has gone mad. But yesterday I was talking to some of our comrades in a different part of the world, and they said that actually there is another trend now of people saying they're tired of people saying that things have gone mad. What they want is a rational explanation. Have you met this particular phenomenon?
Yeah, I've met it on paper sales. People who will agree with you. I often, one of the techniques I use when I'm selling the paper is to ask people, what do you think of what's going on in the world? And you always get this look of like, yeah, it's like big things are happening. And where's the world going? That's the general kind of response you get. But you see, what's happening is when you were saying about, understanding the process, is that the contradictions that have led to this situation have been piling up for decades. And usually it's below the surface. Yeah. You can't see, unless you take the time to study and analyze what's going on. So long as it's not touching your life, you tend to, you don't look deep down to see, what might happen in 5 or 10 years' time. But that process was going on, right? We as Marxists, we observe that to understand where it's going. But what's happening now, it's all coming to the surface. The process is accelerating in a dialectical manner. The accumulation of a mass of contradictions, one upon the other, is producing a qualitative change in the situation, and it's accelerating. And it's suddenly hitting millions of people. Something big is happening here. But the big thing is, it's not a good thing. It's making people's lives much more difficult. Yeah. And so people are asking themselves, why is all this? I think instinctively, a lot of working class people have this idea, the people at the top are to blame. How it works out, that's another question. How it works, that's what we got to discuss.
Yeah. I think one thing that's really changed is that for decades, as a worker, you go to work, you keep your head down, you have so much to do, you have so much to... It's not, in normal times, you leave politics to the people in the know, to the experts. And for decades, it seemed to make sense. What we were told seemed to make sense, at least in the West, in the Western world. After World War II, life was getting better. The ideas coming out of the ruling class that we can improve life as long as we apply our methods and our explanations, it seemed to work. It seemed to, make sense in practice. But it no longer does. And I think now people are faced with this fact that, all of these things that are happening don't necessarily correspond. If you look a little bit closer, don't correspond to the explanations we've been given. And so they're standing without a guiding compass, you can say. There's a crisis of bourgeois philosophy amongst the mass of the population. They're standing there without a guiding compass, and they're looking at these things, and they don't know. They're trying to make sense of it. As you said, they have an instinct, but people want to have a deeper understanding of why is this happening, and that is what today's show is about. In fact, we have taken up 3 questions which come up regularly when we, as communists, are selling our paper. We talk about we live in Britain. We sell the British paper of the Revolutionary Communist International, which is called The Communist. We see it in with our friends, and families. You see it all over society. People are asking these questions, and the three important and very general ones of these, I think we've taken up to answer and to kind of try to deal with today. And the first question is in last week's episode, at one point, I made a comment. I said, in imposing tariffs and trying to export the crisis of American capitalism, Trump, in essence, is trying to stabilize the situation, as in by exporting unemployment, by trying to bring in jobs, exporting unemployment. From a capitalist point of view, that is a means of stabilizing the situation. But there was a person who was listening or watching on YouTube who just marked this particular moment of the episode with 3 question marks. What is this guy saying? Trump trying to stabilize the situation? And yeah, it makes sense to ask that question.
It does.
What do you think, Fred? Do you think he's a stabilizing force?
Well, I would say he's neither one nor the other. It's not a question of whether he is destabilizing or trying to stabilize. It's, first of all, was the system stable before he won the elections? Who has destabilized the world? The question is this, you see, we've often said capitalism is a system whereby if you try and stabilize the economic situation, i.e., for instance, bring down the enormously unsustainable debt that exists everywhere, in order to do that, you destabilize society. Because in order to bring down the debt, you've got to do things like cut people's benefits. In Britain, there is a big polemic now about young people who have disabilities, who, when they get to the age of 16, have got to apply as adults, right? And a lot of them are being refused the benefit which they need to survive. Their families need to give them full-time care. I read one case, one mother went all the way to court and took the department of the government department to court and won that particular case. This is happening all the time. Why? Because they're trying to cut the debt by cutting spending. Now, by doing that, you are hitting millions of ordinary people. So you try and stabilize the economy, but you destabilize the political scenario. Why? Well, if you keep hitting ordinary working people, millions of them like this, that's going to have an impact on the way they vote at a certain point. And they will look for whoever offers an answer to their problems. And suddenly you see parties which governed for decades collapsing, and parties which were considered insignificant, marginal, or didn't even exist until yesterday, suddenly appearing and growing. And people the instability. Now, you could say that Trump, he's destabilizing because of his actions. But he's a product of the instability. He's a product of the previous period in which all governments, and in America, this was also the case, constant pressure on the working class, eating away at people's living standards, inflation and wages not keeping up, healthcare, all the services,
pressure on
massive pressure on the working class, and reaching a breaking point where they can't take it anymore. Now, who provoked that? Was it Trump? Or was it Biden and his friends? In reality, it's the ruling class as a whole, it's the capitalist class as a whole, which is really increasing the pressure on the working class to sort out its own problems, such as profitability, market shares, competition, etc., etc. They're trying to stabilize their position in the world economy. And the way each country does that is, one, at the expense of other countries, and two, at the expense of their own working class. And then they're surprised that you have conflicts between nations and conflicts between the classes and political instability. So I would say that he's not destabilizing. He's an element of the destabilization. He's part of it, but he's a product of it at the same time. How do you explain the millions that voted for him if it's not for the unstable situation that society is in, the difficult living conditions of ordinary working class people, which has allowed a figure like this to emerge on the scene and behave the way he's behaving? So I would say that it's neither one nor the other. But let's take, for example, the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war, put Trump to one side before he comes on the scene, right? What has the Ukraine war done to Europe? It has massively hit Germany. It has massively increased the cost of energy for the German industry, has pushed Germany into the third year of recession. It's massively affected the whole of Europe. Ordinary working class people are getting massive gas and electricity bills as a consequence of this, because of the cutting off of the cheap oil and gas from Russia. Now, that war has contributed to massively destabilizing every single country in Europe, right? Trump didn't do that. That was Biden and his friends. Now, in a certain sense, you could say that, of course, that's not his aim. He wants to hit Europe. He's imposing tariffs. We can talk about that afterwards. But he's trying to pull out of the Ukraine. He's trying to bring that war to an end. In a certain sense, in his own logic, he's actually trying to stabilize. Now, the problem is you're trying to stabilize a system which cannot be stabilized because of its inner contradictions. We can look at that later on.
Yeah, I think there is a definite campaign going on at the moment, trying to put all the bad things that are happening now on Trump. You know, the economy is going down, everything is falling apart, things are not working. And certainly Trump is a destabilizing force in a sense, in that he breaks up the past. But the problem is, as you say, all of the contradictions which were built up in the past period. We're talking about world debt. Now, one of the main fundamental laws of capitalism is that it regularly goes into crisis. That is baked into capitalism. And it's a way of squeezing out infectious pus, if you may, of overproduction. And this happens on a regular basis. However, since the 80s, I even want to say, but at least the year 2000, we've had three major crises on a world scale. In the early 2000s, we had the dot-com bubble. Then we had the 2008, the Great Recession, which was a major crisis. Then we had the crisis around the pandemic. And in all of the intervening years, we've had, dips, small dips, and so on. These crises were, from a point of view of capitalism, they were supposed to happen to take away unprofitable and whatever, to clear out a part of the market for the system to begin again. Obviously, at a huge cost for the working class. But the way that the ruling class dealt with these was by massively increasing debt and credit. The American national debt stood at $5 trillion in the year 2000. Today, it's at $36 trillion. World debt today is at 318 trillion, which is well above 100% of the world GDP. Now, the capitalists thought that they had found a way to overcome the contradictions of capitalism. But there is a small problem, is that debt has to be repaid with an interest. And we see that now in France, for example. We see that there's a budget deficit of 6% of GDP, which needs to be covered. And how do they need to be covered? By massive cuts into state spending, i.e. either tax rises or cuts into social welfare. What does that mean? That means that same crisis, which has been pushed and pushed and pushed, is a massive snowball that's ballooned and ballooned, is now has to be unloaded onto the shoulders of the working class. Back then, the capitalists didn't want to do this for two reasons. One, they were afraid of the impact it would have on the working class, but also they were making tons of money out of it. Every time you saw one of these stimulus packages, you saw a stock market bonanza. Stock market increases to almost exactly the same amount as they were printing money and putting into the market. Similar amounts were then seen as rises in share prices. And you had these massive multi-billionaires such as Elon Musk and other people who came out as a result of that. But even before, and it's impossible to pay these loans back for the majority of countries, in fact. But even before starting to tackle these debts, in the US, we see now every 4 months, I think, or 3 months, they add $1 more trillion to the debt. So it's just going up and up and up and up. By the way, they also added to it by the wars that they fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. Even before that, you see restrictions on public spending, which affects welfare, which affects the working class, and as you say, which has been piling up and up on the shoulders of the workers. The capitalists were completely oblivious to that, and now they're in a situation where, Trump has come up as a result of the anger and resentment that has caused, but also his actions is now pricking that bubble that they created. They, in fact, acted in a very, very irresponsible way from a capitalist point of view, not from a working class, from a capitalist point of view. And now his erratic behavior, his destabilizing behavior, if you may, is pricking that bubble, which was bound to burst sooner or later. I see that you made loads of notes.
Yeah, to remember.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you see, capitalism goes through cyclical crises. It's been like that ever since it came into existence. There's a period of expansion, market expands, investment, development, productive forces. They reach a point where the productive capacity goes beyond the market. I mean, I'm not going to go into the details of Marxist analysis of economics, but this creates a slowdown, a recession, a crisis. And usually what needs to be done in those moments is certain sections of the economy, certain bits, let's say, of the productive forces, need to be destroyed in order to allow the recovery to take off again. In normal conditions, the capitalists that are not competitive would go bankrupt and the workers would lose their jobs and there would be a deep crisis and then there would be a slow beginning of a recovery. Now, I think there is an important element here which is very different from the past. You see, when we look at history, and we learn from history, obviously, but not everything that we see today finds an answer in history, because otherwise we're just saying that it's exactly the same situation. 80 years of development since the Second World War, globalization, expansion of capitalism to every sector of the world, a huge development of the working class itself. These are new elements in a sense. They're old and new at the same time. But in what sense? The working class has never been so big. The people who work for a wage, let's put it that way. When Marx said that capitalism proletarianizes, you have all the clever professors at universities say, oh, Marx got it all wrong, proletarianizing. But it's true. if by proletarian you don't think like some people think, oh, it means some very poor person. It means somebody who sells their labor to somebody else
In order to survive.
to get a wage. Now, that wage can be low, medium, it can even be a very good wage. And if it's a very good wage, you can even have the illusion that you're not a proletarian. But the day comes when the company can no longer afford to give you that job. Your standard of living plummets suddenly because you lose your wages. Now, in normal functioning of capitalism is let them go to the wall, right? But what we've seen, we've had banking crises where they should have just allowed a whole bunch of banks to collapse. That's what some serious bourgeois say. Just let them collapse.
That's the market, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the way the market works. The invisible hand of the market, and it regulates everything, and the weak ones are destroyed, and then the healthy ones survive, and we take off again. The problem is, you see, you let all those banks collapse, the connections they have all throughout the economy, the funding, the loans, etc. It risks a serious economic crisis. Because the working class is so big, it reminds me, I was reading Trotsky in the 30s in one text where there's a discussion about the nature of the way the ruling class governs moments of crisis, let's put it that way.
Yes.
And he makes a point about finance capital. He says finance capital cannot, some will say, finance capital decides everything. They govern, they decide where everything. He makes the point, finance capital has to take account of the other sections of the bourgeoisie, but also how the masses down below react to what they're doing. Now, when you've got a working class the size that it is today, any serious attack on the working class is going to provoke the workers into action. And if the workers, who are the overwhelming majority of the population, begin to move, then the ruling class has a serious problem. Yeah. That is the way things are developing. Just one little detail. I was talking to a relative of mine the other day. He asked me, what do you do? And I said, well, I explained. And then when you hear the word politics, I'm not interested in politics. He said, I've never voted, he said. When they come and knock on my door, you know what I tell them, he said? I tell them, you're all liars. I don't vote for any of you, right? And I made the point. I said, I know what you're saying, that you're not interested in politics. I said, but, politics is interested in you. And he actually smiled and had to nod his head because he's thinking, yeah, because now they are coming for us, right? Now I was thinking, what moves a person like that, working class lad, right, who behaves like that and thinks, I'm not interested, right, but can feel all the rest of the problems coming. He may not go to vote because he's sick and he thinks they're all liars. The day is going to come, he's going to go out on the street with other working class people. Yeah. He's going to start fighting when the things go beyond the limit. That is what the ruling class is faced with. And that explains why, one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, one of the key reasons why, instead of allowing companies to go under and banks to collapse, governments stepped in, bailed out the banks, gave them huge amounts of public money, in effect, transformed what was a private debt and added it to the public debt, massively ballooning public debt. Yeah. The next step is, of course, you got to pay that. Yeah. And that means you got to tax people's standard of living. Yeah. You got to cut back. Yeah. And it's hitting people now. That's what's happening. The crisis which they tried to delay, which erupted in 2008 is in a financial crisis. And even that, they tried to get around by bailing them out and funding, is now coming to the surface as a real crisis of the system.
Yeah. Yes, and I think there's another side to it as well that I just want to highlight before we continue, which is while they obviously fear taking on the working class head on, they have been taking it on in a sideways manner, if you may, in an indirect manner. And we've seen slow deterioration of the conditions of the workers, slow deterioration of the buying power of the workers, inflation. In fact, inflation numbers are massively underreported, underrated. And on the other end of the spectrum, we've seen massive rise of the wealth of the top 1%. Just a couple of figures. In the US, CEO wages or compensation has grown by 1,085% since 1987. Already back then, there was enormous inequality between them. But since then, the CEO income has gone up by 1,085%, while the average worker's salary has grown by 24%. And inflation has grown by much more than that in that period. So while the workers have seen their buying power reduced, the rich have seen a massive increase of their wealth. There's been a huge rise of inequality. Now, another figure I found here is the bottom half of households that have an average net worth of $51,000 in the US collectively own 2.5% of household wealth in the US. The top 10% of households, however, have an average net worth of nearly 7 million and own more than 2/3 of household wealth in the country. That's an enormous gap and divide that's developed. It was already there in the post-war period, but it's massively increased. And you've seen, by taking these measures, the capitalists they've been getting rich, and they thought they found a golden solution. This is what I'm trying to get at. They thought they cracked the code to get rich unimpededly and to eat and devour, while not taking responsibility, be held accountable for it. They also had another thing: the collapse of the Soviet Union, which meant that America, and as a part of that, European imperialism came out as the dominant force. America came out as the sole superpower on the planet, which gave the American ruling class a certain arrogance. Francis Fukuyama back then said this: the end of history, and the ruling class bought that idea. They bought their own propaganda, thinking that they now won the class struggle. History was finished. We are the boys now. One war after another. They attacked Iraq, 1, 2, 3 times. They invaded Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Yugoslavia. And again, here we see on a world relations, the same thing we saw in economics. They stretched the system far beyond its natural limits. They overextended themselves, and instead, they bought their own propaganda. They thought they found a solution to the problems of capitalism. Oh, you can just print money, and you can just double down. Every time there was a problem, they printed more money. Every time they were opposed on a world scale, they just doubled down. In Ukraine, we saw this. It was clear from very early on that they lost this war. In Afghanistan, we saw this. In Iraq, we saw this. These wars were unwinnable for different reasons, but they were unwinnable. But what did they do? They doubled down. And in doing so, they increased the crisis. And the same with the working class, realizing that the workers, due to the betrayal of the leaders, did not rise. All of these crises came and went. No one did anything. We can just continue as we have. And they lived in this bubble where they're enjoying this kind of, in a delirium in reality. And anyone who raised a criticism, saying, a voice of reason in the room, were pushed aside. There was that guy, Nouri al-Rubini, if you remember. He was the one who's saying, this is unsustainable. All of this debt is going to lead to a crisis. What did they call him? Dr. Doom. Yeah. They joked at him, that's Dr. Doom, But he was actually an intelligent bourgeois. And he was seeing that the system was being stretched beyond its limits. But those guys, there was a process of selection where, in reality, the most short-sighted, stupid elements rose to the top. Another element of this, just to add, the total crushing domination of the stock market, where you don't build factories for the next 30 years. You invest for gain in a month or 2 months. You had whole companies like Tesla, which makes very little profit in reality, but is a huge net worth, trillions of dollars, is a mirage, is a bubble in reality. So you have the crushing domination of the stock market, extreme short-term thinking, wanting to continue this bonanza, and only therefore promoting people who also lived in this delirium. We are the boys, we can do whatever we want, there's no consequences. And here you have the rise of Donald Trump, because in reality, as you say, underneath the surface, resentment was rising, economic contradictions were piling up, contradictions in US imperialism was piling up. And he sees the system from inside. He's kind of an outsider, you can say, from a capitalist in the ruling class. He's a capitalist, he's a bourgeois, but he's kind of an oddball. He's not really, a part of the capital aristocracy, as Alan Woods once humorously said. And he sees everything, and for his own reasons, megalomania, egotism, whatever it is, he bases himself on that. He says it. It's like the Empress. What's it called? The Emperor's. What was the story called? The Emperor's new clothes. Yes, right. He says, look, and he bases him. He says he appeals demagogically to the working class. He talks about the working class, and the workers, obviously a part of them, feel heard. And he says, look, we're overstretched. Why are we fighting all of these wars where we can't? We've been defeated in Ukraine. That's in reality what he's doing is an admission of defeat. From a capitalist point of view, it makes sense. His tariffs, that's another. We'll get to the tariffs. But you see, this is a thing that I keep repeating to myself. In the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. He sees part of the problems, and he represents and people around him, the libertarians like J.D. Vance. They see a part of the problems of capitalism. And they realize we can't go on like this. So in a way, they do represent a stabilizing force, if you may, as in the system needing to, they kind of embody the need of the system to stabilize themselves, even though they also have their own individual outlooks. But obviously, that's not necessarily going to lead to stabilization. We're going to continue to the next segment. Do you have any final remarks before we continue? Because that's where we deal with this particular point. And Trump.
Just to comment on some of the things you said very quickly. This the polarization of wealth, i.e., what you have is growing poverty at one level and a massive concentration at the other. Marx referred to the concentration of capital. Again, we see how Marx was right on this. Yes. And this polarization of society is actually getting sharper, right? And this is what is creating the suffering of ordinary working class people. On the question of this, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they thought we won, and we are the guys, we can do whatever we want. They thought they could just police the world as they wished. But as you say, they overstretched themselves. The other point you were raising about this spend policy and literally printing money, massively increasing debt. It's interesting to see how they don't learn from history. After the 30s, the line of the serious bourgeois economists was, never again. We're never going to do that, just printing money and producing hyperinflation and destabilize the whole system. We're not going to do it again. That was a kind of basic rule that they'd established. But they are doing it again, and they have done it again massively.
Incidentally, Trump also did that.
Yes.
crisis.
But the other thing, you see, a system like this, which is sick, the ruling class can no longer think in the long term. When you were saying, making a quick buck, it was all about these whiz kids, these smart kids in the stock market, in the city, etc. All thought they were making the money, and if anybody, as you say, reminded them that this can't go on forever. This balloon is going to burst. They didn't want to hear it. It's like, it's like the guy who comes to the party, everybody's having a good time, and he says, you're going to have a hangover tomorrow. Oh, get out of here. Yeah. You're ruining the party. But he's actually reminding them of the truth. And the reality eventually hits them on the head. And what's happening here is reality is smacking all of them in the face. Yes. They've reached the point where they cannot govern like they did before. And Trump is a product of that. Basically, it's a distorted expression of a necessity to say, in the case of the United States, we've said this many times, I'm not going to go into it in detail, is we can't police the whole world. Putin can police that bit. The Chinese are a big problem. We've got other problems. We've got other areas. We've got to look after our own backyard. And as you say, yes, it's an attempt to stabilize in the sense to say we can't continue like this. We can't spend all this military for the Europeans. We can't be involved in all these wars. We've got to look at our interests. It's in a sense, it's an attempt to stabilize, but it's also going to fail because Trump cannot sort out the contradictions of capitalism. Now, there's just one little detail that I wanted to highlight. And why is he seen by a lot of working class people as a guy that is better, let's say, than Biden? I was looking at the figures of inflation under Trump. 2017 to 20, and then under Biden. And if you look at the combined level of inflation in the 4 years of the previous Trump term, it's something like roughly 9% over 4 years. Under Biden, over 4 years, it was about 25%. They had some wage increases, but they didn't make up for it. So you see how people look at that and say, well, a lot of things got a lot worse under Biden. And they did. Yeah. Now, we know that is not because of Biden or Trump or whoever is the president. It's because of the way the system works. But, average people look at who's in government, things are bad, it's their fault. Now, it is their fault because they don't act in the interest of working class people. But it's the system that works like this. It's the capitalist system. That is talking about what you said at the beginning, getting an understanding of why all this is happening. The understanding is that in the consciousness of millions of people, the idea that it's not this politician or that politician, this party or that little detail of a policy. It's the system as a whole, which is the problem. Yeah. And unless you remove it, these problems are going to continue.
Yes, and that is a perfect end to this part of the program. And continuing to the next question, because we had a comment. It appears to be someone who supports Trump, but there was a comment also on the last week's video, which read as follows. He says, there's lots of contradictions in your arguments. You criticize Trump's tariffs policy and said that it would cause global market chaos. But in the same breath, you highlight that the options, free trade and competition, are only a sham because they lead to the same market instability as in the Mexico example. I think we discussed Mexico and NAFTA and these things. This has always been the failure of socialism, its inability to maintain a consistent argument due to the a priori assumptions of market forces and actions. I think this is a really good question, and I think a lot of people would ask this. Aren't we saying first we criticize the free market? We say it's not a solution. It's not leading anywhere, and then we say. And it's prepared this situation. It's prepared Trump. They didn't want to take the crisis head on, and they've created a mess. They caused this pile of debt and contradictions within the economy. But in the same breath, when we come and say Trump is not a solution, it's going to lead to crisis. There's going to be a fragmentation of the world market. It's going to lead to deep crises and the destruction of the productive forces. Can we make up our mind? Is it one or another?
Well, you see, I understand somebody who's not a socialist, a communist, doesn't think in terms of the class contradictions of society and the need to change it, will say, okay, you socialists, communists, whatever, what have you got to say about this? Now, you see, is it the task of Marxists to find a solution to the problems of the capitalists for the capitalists, i.e., to find a mechanism which will make capitalism work better in the interests of working class people? Because if that's what you think, then of course, oh, well, is it free trade or is it protectionism? One or the other. And then you say this one doesn't work and that one. So make up your mind. Well, we have made up our mind a long time ago. Neither one nor the other works, because it's not this or that policy. It's the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, which I'll go into in a minute. We're fighting for the abolition of capitalism, not for more or less protectionism, more or less free trade. And let's look at the question. Look, the question of free trade and protectionism, both the United States and Britain and many other countries, they've had periods in their history where they applied a protectionist policy. Other periods where they were champions of free trade. And then the protectionism comes back again. Now, why does it swing this way? Well, think about it this way. Britain, in the early days, was nurturing its industry and was protecting its home market. Once its industry had developed to a degree where it was competitive, and in effect, nobody could compete with them because they have a very advanced industrial apparatus, etc., they could compete on the basis of free trade, and nobody could come into their market. Other countries try to protect. So you have the free trader is usually the country that has a developed industry that's competitive, has clearly saturated its own home market, and needs to expand onto foreign markets, and therefore demands that other countries open up their market and become free traders. Why? Because we want to sell our goods into your country.
Because we're more productive than you.
Yeah. And this is unfair trading. There's always unfair trade. Oh, it's unfair what you're doing because you're applying. You did it yesterday while you were developing yours. The Americans in the 1800s had protectionism. And then in the 20th century, after the war, they became the champions of free trade. Why? Because they were the most advanced capitalist country on the planet. They had advanced technology. They had a developed industry, and they wanted to open up everybody else's market. So you have the movement towards, the World Trade Organization, globalization, bringing down trade barriers, etc. I'll give you a little example. America has a very advanced agriculture, industrial agriculture. Yeah. They can produce rice, even though they use massive machinery. The workforce is tiny. America produces a huge amount of food with a very small workforce. Why? You look at the pictures, 5 combine harvesters going together down a massive field, spraying with planes, not by hand, not digging by hand like some peasants in a poor country, but the huge machinery. That makes them very competitive. Over the years, they have forced country after country, the former colonial countries, to bring down the tariffs they had on food. What were these countries doing? They were protecting their small farmers, who obviously couldn't compete with that. And that made some of these countries were self-sufficient, say in rice and other products. They were forced to bring the tariffs right down. Then the market was inundated with American products. The small farmers went bust, concentrated in the cities as urban poor, living in slums, but now completely dependent on the imports of American food. So you can see how free trade here massively damaged that country to the benefit, obviously, the big agro industry of America. So for us, it's not a question of one is better than the other. All countries have gone through periods where they've had one or the other policy. Now, think about it. The ideal, if we're looking at the capitalist system as a global whole system, from the point of view of maximizing productivity, free trade, absolute 100% pure free trade is the best thing. Why? In a completely free trade situation, i.e., you've got to compete with your level of technology, with your productivity, then the incentive is to invest in the most advanced and the latest technology to increase the productivity to the maximum of your workforce, so you produce far more with a smaller workforce and become much more productive and therefore more competitive. Now, objectively speaking, you would have pockets of extremely advanced industry around the world, but there would be winners and losers. Now, when you have winners and losers, and when the winners are nation states and the losers are nation states, the nations that are winners will be the free traders, and those that are losing will tend to move towards protectionism. Now, the fact is that actually brings us back to a point of Marx when he said one of the obstacles to the development of productive force is the nation state. The capitalist class is not one global class. There's an American bourgeois, there is a German bourgeois, there's a Japanese bourgeois. These have also their national interests, and their governments serve the interests of their national capitalist classes. And if a particular bourgeois is falling behind, they're going to tend to go towards protectionism. This is what is happening here. The United States has declined relatively over the last historical period. It's not at the level, it's facing the strong competition of China. Yes. And America now, under Trump, is turning protectionist, trying to defend its home market and its home industry. The Chinese, paradoxically, the supposedly communists, the free traders of China, why? Because they're competitive. They've emerged as a power. They want the markets to stay open. It's in their interest, obviously.
But you see, they have higher productivity than the Americans.
That's right. But the problem here is this. The productive capacity of industry globally has grown to a level where it's far beyond what the world market can absorb. Now, that means individual national capitalist classes can only increase their share at the expense of somebody else. In the post-war period, the market was expanding. You know, when the cake is getting bigger, even if you got a small slice of that cake, your small slice is getting bigger. Yeah. But if the cake stops growing and actually starts to contract, if you want to keep even that small slice, you can only do it at the expense of somebody else. And that means you tend to move towards protectionism and conflicts and wars. Wars are also products of this conflict. Spheres of influence, what do they mean? It means an area that you dominate and you control the market, and you sell your goods in it, and you defend your capitalist class and their profits. That is what is happening. So we would say this, it's not a question of being for or against. We don't say, oh, terrible Trump, he's imposing tariffs, this is such a bad thing. What we do is we objectively explain the consequences of it on a capitalist basis. Because look, what's happening is retaliatory measures. The Canadians have done it, the Mexicans have done it, the Chinese are doing it, the Europeans have answered. Right. If you have tit-for-tat retaliation of protectionism, the end result is you suffocate the world market. And you actually can altogether contribute to provoking a depression in the economy. Now, to come to the point, I've got here the United Auto Workers and other unions in America saying that on this question, they support Trump's tariffs to defend American jobs. Well, I've got other figures which show how many jobs in America, millions of jobs actually, which are dependent on the EU-US trade relationship, which is the biggest and closest in the world. Millions of jobs depend on this relationship on both sides of the Atlantic. If you go down the road of reciprocal and retaliatory measures in terms of import controls or tariffs, people are going to lose their jobs in America, and people are going to lose their jobs in Europe. And Trump's going to be responsible for that. Now, we have a duty to say that is what would happen. Now, of course, we also have the duty to say free trade also means, for example, if the Chinese are very productive in one sector, they can produce more cheaply, people are going to lose their jobs. Yeah. It's not one is better than the other. It's a consequence of the way capitalism works. That's what we have to explain. Therefore, it's not a contradiction to say neither one nor the other, or make your mind up which one. No, neither of them work because neither of them solve the problem of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism and the way it works.
You know, as Marxists, one of the main contributions of Marx and Engels, or at the core of their theory, is the idea that any social system can survive and progress as long as it's developing the means of production, as long as it develops industry, science, technique, and raises the productivity of labor, raises the mastery of humanity over nature. What does that mean in practice? After World War II, America came out as the dominant force on a world scale, whereas Europe was completely destroyed. Now, there you can say that was a crisis that capitalism ended up in order to sweep away all of this overproduction that was piling up. But what we had in the US back then was a capitalist class which actually developed the means of production massively. You saw the developments of a whole series of new industries on a huge scale. You had semiconductors, you had plastic, you had chemistry, you had mechanics on a new level. And American productivity was huge. More than 50% of the world's GDP was being produced in America by American workers. And it was on the basis of that, by the way, that the American capitalist class could afford to give a certain concessions to the American workers to buy social peace, in essence. They could give relatively good incomes. One American worker could look after, with an income of one person, you could look after a family of 4 or 5. You have a house, you can have 1 or 2 cars, go on holidays. You have a good life, a decent life compared to obviously other societies. And that's when they opened the markets, because as you say, they were much more productive and competitive, and Americans was pushing for the markets other markets to open up to American goods that they then penetrated with. Now, what you have today is actually an American ruling class, which again we've seen American capitalism go from being an industrial capitalist class, or at least the industrial capitalists have a significant weight in American capitalism, to one which has increasingly become dominated by finance capital, by Wall Street, in essence. And for the last many decades, it's not that there hasn't been any development. America is still the most productive country in the world, as far as I understand, in terms of labor productivity, or one of them. But you don't see the same development of the productive forces. You don't see new industries. I guess you've seen the internet, and now you see the rise of AI as new industries which will change things. But it's nothing compared to the flurry of development you had in after World War II. And they are not, in fact, investment in long-term productivity raises. Investment in new industries is declining and has been declining for the past 40 or 50 years. In essence, the American ruling class has become more and more parasitic. And the return of protectionism, which is not Trump's making, this was its tendency, this was a trend that we analyzed for years ago, that it was going to come. And already, as we've said many times before, Biden expanded on this. Trump started it really with his trade war against Russia. Then Biden expanded on it, and now Trump is continuing it. Is an admission of the fact that America and American capitalism cannot develop the means of production. which is why also it can't afford the same living standards to its workers. China, on the other hand, is nowhere near the same level of agility as America had in after World War II, as American capitalism had. But they have developed the means of production. You have seen the development of Chinese industry, and even now in the fields of AI and robotics, China is very close, if not number one. Quantum computers, a lot of these new kind of frontiers in the development of science and technique, the Chinese are in the lead, in fact. And that is a threat to American imperialism. That is the reason for the rise of protectionism as we see it now. But as we see also, it's not a question, it's, of course, the individual has a role to play. Trump has his own idea of how things has to be. And he might, you saw Biden had his ideas of never back down, extreme warmonger. Trump is less for actual war, more trade war type of person. They have different nuances in their wishes, and that obviously has an impact on how the system develops. However, they cannot get around the fact that the system is now bound up in insoluble contradictions, in particular economic contradictions. The only way to solve these contradictions, the huge pile of debt, the massive overproduction, the whole of this industry and the world market coming to a grinding halt, who's going to pay the price for that? Is Wall Street going to pay? Or the bosses are going to pay? Or the working class going to pay? And here, Trump, even though he's wary and he appeals and he doesn't want to step too much on the toes of the working class, but he represents the interests of the bosses. And the only way they can overcome this crisis is by massive attacks. The only way capitalism can resolve this crisis is by a massive attack against the working class, which in turn has only one way out, which is to fight back, which is to fight for power. And therefore, this situation, inevitably, Trump is already the first, kind of a reflection of the first stages of this process, inevitably will lead to a massive rise of class struggle, which will put the question on the agenda of who rules society. The bosses, who are parasites, who live off the labor of the mass of the millions and millions of workers, or the working class who actually produce all of the wealth in society. That's the question that we're really facing.
Well, what you said, after the Second World War, and before we go into that, often there's discussions about how the Depression of the 30s was overcome, or Roosevelt's policies, the New Deal. The solution to the crisis of the 30s was the Second World War. It wasn't just a chance occurrence. Massive destruction of productive forces was one of the conditions that allowed the post-war boom to take off. There was obviously massive accumulation of capital in the United States, huge profits during the war, and they were used obviously to put Europe back on its feet. Once that boom took off, capitalism had a new lease of life for a period of about 25, 30 years, where that development allowed for real reforms, as you were saying. Look, in Britain, we had the NHS. That stays in the memory of the working class. It hasn't gone away. This marvelous thing that the working class fought for and won, i.e., if you're poor and you're sick, you don't have to die. The doctor's there, the hospital's there. You're going to be looked after. It's not a question. It's not a question of rich and poor. Everybody has the right to this, and it's become an idea that it's a human right. Right? In America, they still maintain the idea that no, it's something you pay for. If you can't afford it, you can't afford it. But in America, on the back of that was the American dream, which goes back many years. The idea that America is the place where the economy develops, standard of living grows, life is getting better and better. That provided the system with the stability. The stability began to break down once we reached the limits of that boom period, which was in the 70s. In effect, the last 50 years have been a steady eating back of everything they gave previously, and now they've reached a critical point. Now, on the question of the development of the economy, what the capitalists, or what some of these whiz kids who think they're really clever in the economy, is that they forgot the fact that value is actually the production of real goods. That finance capital is accumulated out of the profits that you make from actually producing things. The strength of China, a few years ago, I was looking into, when we wrote all the material we wrote on China, there was a moment in which, if you looked at the China's GDP, something like 40% of it was industrial. Germany was about 25%. Again, in Europe, it was the strong economy. These two countries, which were, I mean, Germany's now in decline, obviously, the strength was in their industrial base, i.e., a large part of the wealth was real industrial production, production of goods. They developed the idea that you could make money from money bypassing production of goods. That's, the stock market, all these different investment schemes they have, these bubbles basically where you make money from money. In the end, that actually produces inflation. So it feeds through into the system at a certain point and starts to affect working class people. Now, as you said, they talk about protectionism. Biden did not cancel Trump's protectionist measures against China. Why? That expressed a necessity. He was doing something which was actually in the interests of the American ruling class. So therefore, why undo something which you consider useful? Biden continued with it. Now it's sharpening, obviously, because of the contradictions. But the thing is this, tariffs, if you impose them the way they're being imposed, it's not just finished goods that come into America, It's steel, for example. America, I was looking at the figures, America exports some steel, but if you take the whole amount, imports and exports, there's a net import of about 15% of the steel that it consumes has to come from outside because it hasn't got the capacity to produce enough for what it needs. Tariffs make steel coming in more expensive. Protecting your own steel industry means you facilitate the owners of that industry and they can increase their prices. So a basic ingredient of industry, which is steel, which is used in many, many sectors, aluminium. Coca-Cola says they're going to try and make more plastic bottles now because the increase in the tariffs on aluminium, which is a component, makes it more expensive. It will eventually feed through as inflation at some point. Now, think about it. One of the big things that made Trump popular was that he was going to bring inflation down. Now, at the moment, it's about 3%. The latest figure is just under 3% in America. Nobody can blame Trump for the inflation we have now, obviously. But in 1, 2, or 3 years' time, if this feeds through into the economy as inflation, a lot of people that voted for Trump, hoping that he's the guy, he's the action man that gets things sorted, he's going to bring this terrible pressure of the prices that keep going up. If he fails to act on that, because, as I said, he can't dictate to the economy, he cannot force the economy to behave differently to a capitalist economy, then he will produce that. That means that class struggle will be back on the agenda in America. And just to finish this point, in the previous period, not so long ago, a couple of years back, we had the auto workers, we had the teachers, we had the dockers even more recently. We had, if you remember, there was an outburst of strikes across America. We had it in Britain and other countries. That was actually just a foretaste of a much bigger wave that's going to come once the impact of all this feeds through into the real conditions of working class people.
Yes, absolutely. So the point is not either free trade or protectionism. The point is that capitalism as a system has gone into a crisis which it cannot resolve unless without taking on the working class, without a massive attacks on the living standards of the working class, which in turn will be forced to go on the path of struggle. I think we should continue to the last question, which is, this is not a question, this is not a comment from our YouTube or other channels, but a question that we've heard quite a lot, because you see now the Ukraine war, there is a potential that it could draw to an end now. There's just been negotiations in Saudi Arabia between the US and Ukraine, where the Ukrainians have agreed to a potential ceasefire and the beginnings of a negotiated peace, which is something that Zelensky has refused so far. So this is a big step. And the Russians have made it clear that they are prepared to talk about peace. Obviously, Russia has won this war. America and the West have lost, and therefore Ukraine have also lost. And any peace agreement will be a recognition of that fact. In essence, it's a question of making a peace now and save something, or for the West, or for Russia to continue with the risk of essentially seeing a collapse of the Ukrainian army and the total overrunning of the whole country. We've discussed this in many episodes. That's not the main question here. The one thing that's been raised, and this has been raised actually in the comments, which is, we've said the Europeans are actually now desperate to keep the war going. They are sabotaging all of these negotiations. And obviously, a lot of people have said, "What are you talking about? Russia started this war. They are the ones who should go back." But there's a reason. We'll get to this question. In Europe now, there is a big discussion going on. Last Thursday, there was a EU summit where they decided to raise a fund of 800 billion euros to spend on defense. Germany is the coming German government is looking into passing a law which would allow it to spend another 500 billion euros on defense in the next 10 years. And everywhere in Europe, there's talk of massive rearmament, enormous rearmament. And the thing that's being raised, I'll read out some of the quotes. The Danish, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, said, "Europe has to be able to protect itself and defend itself, as we have to put Ukraine in a position to defend itself and to push for a lasting and just peace." So this is about European defense. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, said, "We need to spend on defense and deterrence." She is one of the most hawkish people here. She says, "We must upgrade massively to protect Denmark, and we must rearm massively to avoid war." She was in Ukraine on the 3rd anniversary of the war, where she said, we should not stop talking about red lines. What does this mean? Red lines, this means a line that Russia would feel so threatened that it would declare war against Europe and the West, and that it potentially would use nuclear weapons. So Mette Frederiksen said, we should not talk about red lines. We should attack in every way we can. In essence, we need to wage a war against Russia directly. Of course, none of them want themselves to do it. She's not sending any Danish soldiers. She says the Ukrainians should forget about red lines, and the Americans are the ones who should fight Russia. But the point is that there is a mood of extreme hysteria which is being prepared in Europe for rearmament and militarization. And the argument that's being used is, okay, let's say Russia wins in Ukraine, which they have. Russia is now right at our doorstep. Russia has one of the most powerful, if at the moment, the strongest army in the world, 1 million battle-hardened people tested against NATO arms a massive defense industry, which is far ahead of the Western defense industry, and so on and so forth, right on our borders in Europe. And we need to arm to defend ourselves. And I think a lot of ordinary people are buying into this, are actually thinking about this. I was talking to Danish comrades, speaking of Denmark, I was talking to Danish comrades recently, and they said, yeah, you hear on the trains people talking about, oh, how much water should we have in our basements to survive, if the Russians attack and we have to. This is the level that they're talking. But the question is that how we guarantee our safety and security? By massive European rearmament, militarization, and defense spending.
Yeah, this is something that you obviously need to answer. I need to explain to people. You see, this war, if we want to be serious, and Trump, you see, on this, when Trump said this war was not necessary, he was right. It was an unnecessary war. I was listening to, actually yesterday, I was listening to an interview with Kissinger about 30 years ago versus this professor who was an ex-ambassador to Russia. And they were discussing expanding NATO. And the professor was trying to say, we shouldn't expand and provoke unnecessarily, basically. And Kissinger was saying, no, we can't have the German border as the border of NATO. Because the countries beyond Germany, not as NATO members, could be invaded, right? So we got to expand. And
so we have to invade.
And it was expand, yeah.
In other words.
Expand. And who was there again? Obviously Russia.
Yeah.
Right? Now, they've moved in that direction for the last 30 years, pushing and pushing, in effect, expanding their sphere of influence.
Their military sphere of influence.
Into the East, right?
Yeah.
In every sense, the European Union has expanded, NATO has expanded, reaching a point where the Russians, clearly, I mean, this is not about taking sides. We're not taking sides between Putin and the Ukrainians or the Americans and Russia. But if you look at each one is behaving according to the interests of their own ruling classes. The Americans and the Europeans, their interests as a class. And of course, the ruling class of Russia also looking at theirs territorially. And we had a situation where you had an agreement, which they could have stuck to. They could have said, NATO is not going to expand any further, which is what the Russians were saying, stop, no further. And there was a series of demands which could have been discussed and negotiated and accepted, what it would have meant is this: admitting that Russia has regained its feet, is stronger than it was, and it has a sphere of influence, right, in effect, its backyard.
It's no longer a Western vassal.
And you're going to have to come to terms with this and make deals, right? Now, that could have happened. Hundreds of thousands of young men would still be alive today if that had been done. Ukraine would not have been destroyed like it has been. There's even talk of the Ukraine becoming a failed state, even collapsing as a state, if this continues. Who's defending the interests of the Ukrainian people here? The West are not defending the interests of Ukraine. They're using the Ukraine. They've used the Ukraine in this absurd attempt to weaken Russia. And they've had the opposite effect. Now, I'm not going to repeat things we've said elsewhere. But they're saying, oh, Russia is a threat and could invade Europe. Well, to be serious, look, Russia's succeeded in the Ukraine, but it's taken a huge effort to achieve what it's achieved. Do they really think that it has the strength and the power simply to occupy the whole of Europe? I think they're raising a scarecrow, right, of Russia. What it is really about is trying to maintain desperately the position of European imperialism in the world, i.e. we're still a power to be reckoned with. But in fact, if you look at France has been squeezed out of Africa. Who by? The Russians and the Chinese, in effect. The Russians militarily and the Chinese with their money. They want to maintain their position because, business is done as powers. Your influence, your contracts, trade with other parts of the world. They want to maintain, but they're in decline. So what they're worried about is this. The Americans are basically saying to them, you got to look after yourselves, mate. We've spent all this money. We can't do this. We're going to pull back. We're looking after our core interests, and you guys are not part of it. That's what they're basically saying to them. This is terrifying the ruling classes of Europe. And this thing of 800 billion euros on defense, what they're talking about is 800 billion euros of more debt. Germany, at the moment, has a debt to GDP ratio of 63%. Mm-hmm. It's relatively healthy compared to the 130% of Italy and other countries. If this continues, if they force Germany to increase spending on this, its debt will balloon to 84%. Germany will start to look more like Italy than what it used to in the past. So what they're presenting is this scarecrow of a war, and they're saying we've got to increase military spending, we've got to strengthen ourselves. But think about it seriously. Look, today's headlines are that Poland is demanding that the Americans place nuclear missiles on Polish territory as a deterrent against Russia. Now, they're saying we've got to be strong enough, and some of them are saying prepared to go to war with Russia in a few years' time. We're not ready. We need to get ready. Think about it like this. Imagine Russia and Europe, finally, a war breaks out. This scenario does reach its worst case scenario. A war. One of the two fronts starts to advance. Let's say, imagine they stick to nuclear warfare, right? In terms of nuclear warfare, conventional warfare, the Russians are much more organized at the moment, more stronger. It's one army against all these different European armies. In a situation where one is advancing against the other, where you have nuclear arms, you're talking about a nuclear war. You're talking about a third world war and the launching of nuclear missiles. So people in Denmark or other countries who are worried about their neighborhoods, their kids, their families, and rightly so, because this danger exists. The idea that the way to defend yourself is by arming and preparing an army to attack Russia, you're preparing the mutual destruction of both sides. You're lucky if you get vaporized. You're one of the first people to get vaporized, then you won't suffer the consequences. If you live a certain distance from where the nuclear missiles hit, you're going to be suffering cancer and destruction of civilized life, barbarism. This is what you're preparing. So the answer to this that we would say is, you want to defend your community, you want to defend your family, fight the people that have an interest in going to war, which is the capitalist class of Europe. And in Russia, the working class has to fight its own ruling class, of course, which has the same interests. It's an international struggle of the workers of all countries. Why did Marx close the manifesto with workers of all lands unite, workers of all countries unite? The only way the working class can really defend its interests, both in terms of the jobs, as we said earlier on, but also in terms of security and peace, is to unite the workers of all countries in a fight against the capitalist class, which has gone way past its sell-by date. It should have left the stage of history a long time ago, but it's time it went now, before it creates any more disasters. That's the way to defend ourselves.
Yeah. Yes, and I would also say, what, as you said, I think you really put your finger on it when you said when you're in imperialist power, you are somebody, right? As long as America was holding a hand over Europe, uniting Europe, having it in NATO, putting forward security guarantees, Europe was a part of the US, the umbrella of American imperialism. These guys were somebodies. Denmark is a tiny country. I can say this because I grew up there. I'm basically Danish. I am Danish in a way. A tiny, insignificant country. And they're nobodies on a world scale without Big Brother behind them. But with the support of US imperialism, they go to the Middle East, they go to Africa, they go to Asia. There's somebody, they kick the door in. The boys are in town, you know. And in Eastern Europe, as you said, the expansion of NATO is not an expansion of a defense collaboration. It's the expansion of European capitalism, of European imperialism into Eastern European countries, which previously were closer to Russia. And the war in Ukraine represented a desire. It's true that Russia started on paper, fired the first shot, although the war inside of Ukraine against the Russian speakers had started before that by the government. But it was provoked, as you say, by the West as a means, one, to dominate Ukraine, but more than that, to weaken Russia and to build towards a situation where Russia could be pushed back into a weak vassal state for the West as it used to be. So therefore, what we're talking about is not a defense of Europe, is a defense of the interests of European imperialism. That's what this means. And when we say the Europeans do not want peace in Ukraine now. Why? Because it means that Trump is going to pull out of Europe. That's what he said. He says, I don't want to have it. You should sort out your own defense. What does that mean? As soon as America is gone, we're no longer the boys. We're no longer the imperialists that we were. We don't have the same power. We don't have the same importance as we're nobodies in reality. And Russia is a somebody. China is a somebody. And they can dictate their terms to us. That's what all of this really amounts to. And in fact, by going, you explain very well what nuclear war means. By going to Ukraine and saying we must abandon any red lines, we must cross any line that would make Russia, all of the lines that would make necessary that would, even if it makes Russia see us as an enemy and attack us. So who is it who's actually suing for war with Russia? It's these guys. They want to continue that war. They want to beat Russia into submission, and they want to drag America into doing it. They don't want to do it themselves. They want to drag America into doing it for them. Now, Russia, it's true, Russia has come out as a major world imperialist power now. However, Russia, from a point of view of Russian imperialism, they have no interest in invading Europe. They don't even have an interest in invading Western Ukraine. They have an interest in Eastern Ukraine, which has large Russian-speaking elements. But you see, they understand better than the Americans that you can't just occupy another country and hold it if the majority of that country is vehemently hostile to you. And therefore, they have no interest whatsoever in invading Europe. They might demand more influence in Eastern Europe, economic influence, diplomatic influence, and they want to expand their sphere. But the idea that the Russians are coming to attack us is complete nonsense in reality. And what it really is the bloodthirst and the warmongering of our ruling classes in Europe. So therefore, I think this, as you said, but to add to that, the solution, if you want peace and stability in Europe, we need to get rid of these guys. They are the warmongers. It's not Putin. It's not anyone else, but our ruling classes themselves. And they are pushing towards a very, very dangerous line. As you say, they have no scruples in doing so. Why? Because that's what guarantees their profits, their privileges, their position of power in society. Which shows us what capitalism is about: is private property and profit over the interest of the broader population. Yeah. I think we need to sum up this episode now. It's been a great discussion, but do you have any final remarks?
Well, very, very quickly to sum up, Russia has emerged as a power. Expanding after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin, he wants to be accepted at the table. He says, look, I'm strong. This is my sphere of influence. And it's not as if the others, they condemn him. Oh, he did this. The Americans invaded Iraq on the basis of what international law? No. They bombed Syria. They bombed Libya. And let's go back. All the coups, the Chile coup, the Argentine regimes, America is not a defender of democracy, right? It has behaved in this manner throughout its history. They have this veneer of bourgeois liberalism. We're the democratic ones, and Putin the bad guy. No, you're all the same. You all have your interests. You all have your spheres of influence. And in this case, the big guy is clearly America. But going back to this question of the Europeans in America, they desperately want the Americans to stay. And what they're looking at is not just the end of the Ukraine war, but the pulling out of US troops, which have been based in Europe for a long time, and being left with basically naked and in the face of a stronger Russia. So, Putin has said, if there were ever an existential threat to Russia, that would justify the use of nuclear weapons. These guys, by talking about the need to go to war, they're talking about that kind of scenario. And we've got to understand, it's not the short-term perspective, obviously, because you see, there's another side to this. Across Europe, I think we're going to get lots of small Trumps appearing, right? The AfD in Germany, Le Pen in France, etc., in Romania, what's going on there with the elections. Politicians who are presented as these mavericks, these odd, extreme politicians, but who are basically saying all this money on NATO, all this money on the Ukraine war, all these, the European Union policies are hurting people. We should need to think of ourselves. I think you're going to see a swing inside Europe. Parties that want to end the Ukraine war are actually getting popular, which reflects a mood which is developing within the population in Europe. So they're trying to stabilize in the global picture, but each individual country is being destabilized, and we're going to see big shifts in politics. And the next phase that follows on from that is obviously an intensification of the class struggle across Europe. That is the perspective which is being prepared. Yeah. And we have absolute confidence that the working class, it can be pulled in this direction or the other. They can vote, some can vote for Trump, some can vote for Meloni, some for the AfD, but they will put them to the test. They will see that they don't have solutions. It will be a bit like a school. You go to a school. In Britain, they're going to the school of reformism for the umpteenth time with Starmer. But they've learnt, in the past it took longer. Now, Starmer is unpopular. And he's been very quick, the process. They've seen straight through him from what he's doing. It's preparing the ground for others, for the Farages. They also will be put to the test. We have to think in these terms, not in terms of, shift to the right, shift to the left. No. Whoever promises an end to inflation, better conditions, an end to the war or whatever, can win elections. And then the masses will sit and wait. What are they doing for us? When they see that their policies do nothing for the working class, as quickly as they shifted towards these forces, they can shift away and look for an alternative. Now, the big issue is the left is incapable, the official left is completely incapable of offering an alternative in this situation. It's in an absolute mess. Mm-hmm. What we have to do as revolutionary communists is speak the truth. Sometimes speaking the truth makes you into a small minority because people don't want to hear the truth. They want to hear what seems an easier option. But we've got to stick to it, connect with the more conscious layers of the working class and the youth, and build up a political force which can start to connect with bigger layers later on when all this starts to feed through into the consciousness of millions of people. That's the task we have ahead of us.
Yes. I think that's an excellent way to end the program today. Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you very much, everyone out there. We will be back again next Thursday, 6 p.m. UK time. This was Against the Stream, and I'm Hamid Alizadeh.